Matthew Sleep, Civil Engineering. I'm going to talk briefly about a geology field trip that I did last spring term for my Geology 201 class. So I co-teach that course, or alternate, I guess it's not really co-teach, I alternate. So Michael Hughes from Natural Sciences teaches it, I guess it would be odd years, and I teach it in even years. It's only offered in the spring term, and it just started to be offered because civil engineering, it's now a required course for our major, and so that's why the university now offers it every single year. So as soon as I found out that I was teaching the course, I sort of immediately knew that I wanted to have a field trip because my undergraduate degree is geological engineering. We did a lot of field trips, and in Mississippi, where I got my undergrad, we have these horrible things called trees and vegetation covering all of the beautiful rocks in geology. And so I really wanted to do a field trip, and so CCT sponsored sort of this initial offering of this field trip. And I'm going to tell you some of the things that I thought were really good about the field trip, some of the things that were bad, and some of the logistical sort of issues with taking a lot of students on a field trip. So 40 students in the course, and 34 of them ended up going on this field trip to Fort Rock, Oregon. So it was a big class. Logistically, I was terrified of taking all these students. It was an overnight camping field trip. So we got there on a Friday, camped overnight, woke up early Saturday morning, and did a whole day of field work. So thank you. It's really awesome that the CCT sponsors or helped fund this field trip. That was fantastic to really get it off the ground and get it started. So this is all of us. So I went, and then Sean St. Clair from Civil Engineering sort of came along for the ride, and then Michael Hughes from Natural Sciences was there as well. So one of the things, one of the guiding themes is that I think field trips are beneficial for students. There is a lot of research to support this. Like a buzzword would be the difference between informal, formal learning, learner-centered. The idea that I wanted to do with this field trip was sort of get beyond the yellow school bus, sack lunch, go to a museum type field trip. Although there is a lot of research that says that even that type of field trip is good. And that's a lot of that research has been really recent because schools don't have a lot of money anymore, and so they're not funding field trips. So when I was planning this field trip, I sort of knew where I wanted to go because I knew it was a geologically interesting area. And I looked at a bunch of other universities' field trips for geology. And so I found that the best way to do this field trip was to model it as sort of a research project, where the students actually went out there, collected data, analyzed the data, and actually did something with the data, as opposed to just having sort of that look at this pretty geology type thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Geology 201, sort of the goal of the field trip versus just basic classroom instruction, and also the logistical sort of implementation, how I actually did the field trip. Here are some of my students. That's as high as he went. It wasn't that dangerous. So it was a little bit scary sometimes because some of the students did decide to sort of climb around on the rocks. So Geology 201, it's an introductory course, so it's sort of introductory to geology. I mean, it's 201, but it could, it's an introductory course. 32 students actually ended up attending. It's a 4-credit course. It's a laboratory-based science. If you are advising students, it counts as a laboratory-based science. I think it has a lot of critical thinking development in the course. I really like geology. I think it's a great course. So physically where we went, so here, this is Klamath Lake, here's Klamath Falls. So we went all the way almost up to Bend and took a right, and then went all the way to Silver Lake, Oregon, Fort Rock, Oregon, which is truly the middle of nowhere. So logistically, that was terrifying. So there wasn't even available gas in Fort Rock, Oregon. So it was really, really scary when we got out there. The reason why I chose this area, it's geologically very interesting. The geologic sites are impressive. So the rock formations are really, you can see them, you can walk on them, you can touch on them. During the last ice age, sort of a little bit technical, during the last ice age, this was underwater. A bunch of volcanic eruptions occurred underwater, and so those volcanic eruptions were preserved, and so that's why this is a really interesting area. It's because those preserved eruptions, you can actually see them. So we left on a Friday, got to a campground, which ended up being a great campground, departed Saturday morning. We did 3 different stops, and I'll talk a little bit about these stops. And then we got back to campus kind of late on Saturday evening. All right, so we only spent 1 night, but I think that was kind of the limit that I was, willing to spend with the students. One thing I will mention is that which I didn't think about when I did this, but I did this trip sort of in addition to classroom and laboratory instruction. And I didn't think about how that would work into the students saying, oh, well, I'm already in lab for X amount of hours in class, but they all wanted to go. I did have an alternate assignment in case anybody didn't want to go. So this first stop, to try and make this into a research project, right, which I think is really beneficial for any field trip, is at each stop, I had them collect data. So that was really important. And also important was sort of the progression of these 3 stops. So just like a course, right? I would start with sort of the easiest thing to understand, and then the last stop was sort of the most difficult geologic thing to interpret. So the first stop was which is called Hole in the Ground. It's a really impressive crater. So the students go there and they think it's an impact crater. It's actually not an impact crater. It's actually this explosive eruption that occurred. I say least effective because the amount of data that I had the students collect here was pretty minimal. So they basically just mapped some geology and sort of told me what was out there, and then they had to draw a cross-section of what the stratigraphy or layers of rock were going to look like. But most of the students, they wanted to climb down in there. I thought that they were going to be like, all right, next, I'm done with this. But they wanted to collect data. And so this idea of research project, I think, is really important. The next stop was to actually the Fort Rock, which geologically is a tuff ring. So it looks like a volcano. Sort of looks like Crater Lake, but without water in it. So this is one of our students, that's Jimmy Lee, and he's standing right here on this ridge, sort of looking down into the actual crater. This was the most effective stop on the trip. The reason being that the students had to collect a lot of data. So what I did was they were in groups, I divided it into 4 quadrants. Each quadrant, the student had to go, and using a compass that we had gained familiarity with in previous labs and trips that we had taken in Klamath Falls, they had to basically map the geology that was there. So they had to take a number of data measurements, data collections at each one of these quadrants. There was also sort of this geological scavenger hunt where they had to find this unconformity that was kind of hidden. But the goal was that they would take these measurements in the field and then create this cross-section. And so that was really, having these well-defined tasks really was great for the students because they could go out there. I didn't have to be a tour guide the whole time, right? Just pointing out things. And they felt like, that created a lot of buy-in. It was like, this is my project, I'm collecting data, I'm actually doing something. The last stop, which is all in the same area, it physically looks like Fort Rock. It's got this sort of ring of mountains around, except in the middle of it, there is this thing that looks like a volcano. So students got out there and they're like, oh, there was a volcano here and it erupted and it created this tuff ring. But sort of like the last one, we went around and we took a bunch of different measurements, and the students then were supposed to, some of them got it, some of it didn't, to figure out that there was actually 2 different eruptive centers, which is possible if you go and you actually take measurements of the geology and stuff like that. But like I said, the progression, right? So we started sort of this easy idea, looks like a crater, then they measured stuff, and now they really have to measure stuff to figure out that there were actually 2 eruptive centers. So those are the stops that we actually went on this trip, and how I thought it was like a research project as opposed to just sort of like a museum tour. Not that there's anything wrong with a museum tour, but this is geology, and they should get out there and measure stuff. All right. So some of the things that I had to do to make this possible, right, is I had to take 4 trips to Fort Rock before I actually took the students out there. I started in the summer prior to teaching the course, which was incredibly valuable. There's a whole lot of literature about this place because it's geologically just an awesome place to go. But I would get this literature and I'd be like, oh, this is great. I'm going to go here and I'm going to see this, and the students are going to be able to see this. And then I physically went out there by myself and I couldn't see anything that the person was talking about in the paper, right? Which happens with geology. You never know exactly where it is in the paper, all sorts of different things. So I took a lot just took a lot of trips, a lot of driving to get out there. And then another essential part was this sort of guidebook. So right at the beginning, I gave them a big packet that was, you're on your own. Here are the steps you need to do to complete this research project. And that got away from me being the tour guide with a large class. Obviously, that's, super important, that the students are working on their own and doing their own thing. So some of the key, this is our campground. You'll see there's a little, there's a stage back here. The locals of Fort Rock put on a concert for us that evening, which was really fantastic. We rented 8 vehicles, 8 minivans. Students drove themselves, which was super important because there was only 3 faculty going. You have to have an amazing office manager, which I do. Kathy Stanek is absolutely amazing and totally supported me with this field trip. You have to do a lot of trusting, right? You have to trust that the students aren't going to go to Bend instead of Fort Rock. With that large of a group, camping is really the only cost-effective way of doing this, which was fine. It was cold a little bit, and it rained a little bit, but none of the students complained. They were okay with camping. And I think it's because I just told them the expectation, we're camping. If you don't want to camp, here's your alternate assignment. I couldn't make students camp. At least I felt like I couldn't make students camp. Food, Fort Rock has no restaurants, or they do, but apparently they weren't interested in having all of the students come there, so they didn't seem interested. So I went to Subway and brought them empty coolers, and they packed the coolers for me, and then just delivered them before we took off. If a student was driving one of these vehicles, I made them sort of an informal TA and just had an honest conversation look, you're sort of in charge of your group, right? And gave them a little bit of responsibility, and I felt that worked out really well. Some of the things about the actually learning process is I don't think that the students should learn any new skills maybe in the field. So in the field, they should be taking the skills that they've learned in the class, right, and applying them. Prior to this, we did 3 other field trips in town. We went to Moore Park, Map Geology. We went to Ponderosa Junior High, which actually has a fault running through the school, so there's actually sort of some displacement there. And so the students were familiar with this idea of using a compass to map geology. So that was really important. Saved a lot of time. I didn't have to lecture a whole lot actually on the trip. And in order to sort of build enthusiasm, I just talked about this trip a lot. Every time I was in class, you guys ready for Fort Rock? It's going to be fantastic. If you were to do a trip like this and you decided that you wanted to do sort of that research type route, well-defined tasks are important. As I mentioned, the trip expectations, we're going to camp, you're going to be walking, there's a level of physical exertion that's going to take place, bring water. The students were surprisingly prepared. I thought that people were going to show up and just say, I don't have a tent, or I don't have a sleeping bag. I thought that was going to happen. I think in an introductory course, this is kind of a geology thing, but it should be visible, so the students should be able to grasp that concept. They get really frustrated if you're trying to say, look how great this fault is, and it's kind of not really a fault. You know what I mean? So buy-in is important, and then also the students must be trusted, which fortunately, and this is just how we teach, right? I think you have an expectation of your students, and generally they meet that expectation as long as you set it pretty high. And so I had a lot of that for the students on this trip because I couldn't be in charge by myself. To make it better, I would have had group leaders. I would have had them turn in a group report instead of individual reports. And I would have found a time and a place for them to work on that group report together, sort of in Fort Rock before we came back. So when it's fresh on their minds, maybe find a community, there's not a lot out there, but maybe find a picnic table or something where the students could get together and sort of decompress and talk about what they have seen. I think that would have been really important. We sort of got kind of late in the day, we got in the cars and we took off. And certainly more is possible. I was really nervous about the logistics. And so the academic rigor was there, but it could be higher, right? And so more is definitely possible. When I take this trip again, which is definitely going to happen, I will just make more happen. So I think, this is like the OIT, PowerPoint presentation, but hands-on education for real-world achievement. I mean, a geology field trip is hands-on, and I guess you could literally say it is the real world, right? You're not on campus. So I think field trips do enhance student learning. It gave the students a tangible and memorable experience, which I think is really important, as is the social community aspects of Oregon Tech. I mean, my undergrad degree was at the University of Mississippi, and Saturdays, we tailgated all day and had football games, and it was definitely collegiate, right? Sometimes the students, because they're at a smaller university, don't have that little social community aspect, I think. So I think things like this are important. And obviously, thanks to Kathy Stanek, she's been on medical leave for a while, which is really upsetting, but she's going to come back soon, which I'm totally excited about. Michael Hughes works with me just on geology. I think it's fantastic, just to collaborate on the same course. And then my department chair, Sean St. Clair, went along on the trip with me. And when I found out that so many students were enrolled, I said, no, I can't do an overnight field trip. And he basically said, I will fire you if you don't do it. You have to go on this field trip. So he really pushed me to do it. So, and hopefully, maybe some of you want to take field trips, right?
Cool.
That's all I got.